All right, so today we are going to be reading from the book Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History by Vashti Harrison. Now, this book was published in 2017, so it's pretty current. And I'd say that makes it a little bit more credible as well, because I believe Vashti would have found the most updated information that she would have had. It's published by Little Brown and Company out of New York and Boston. And Vashti gives us lots of the sources that she used for her research. She used actual interviews from some of her subjects, like Bessie Coleman. That would be an example of a primary source that we've talked about. She used interviews from Shirley Chisholm, giving her speech on why she should be the Democratic nominee. She used, again, actual Maya Angelou quotes, and she also, when she talks about what inspired her to write this, she also talks about some of the websites that she recommends you go to and that she used. She used archive.org, biography.com, Britannica.com, NASA.gov. I would guess she was using that one for her research on Katherine Johnston. We know her from one of our hidden figures. And she used Pulitzer.org. Pulitzer, again, we talk about Pulitzers, that's for newspapers. So newspapers are going to mostly be, you have reporters, they go out, they find this information. It's going to be a really credible source to use. And encyclopedia.com. So Vashti uses some pretty credible resources for her research. Now, before we read, we're going to talk a little bit about some of our vocabulary. So we have gradual, which means slowly. Emancipation, you are trying to free a group, usually from slavery. Abolition, the act of ending slavery. Advocated, you supported. Discrimination, unfair treatment, desegregation, ending separate treatment. We're going to get started. So we're talking today about Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was an abolitionist. She was a women's rights advocate, and she was born around, and they tell us Sojourner Truth circa 1797, which means we don't have an actual date because she was born enslaved and records were not kept as well as they should have been, but we know that she died in 1883. We're going to start reading. Sojourner was born a slave in upstate New York under the name Isabella Baumfree. Under the state's Gradual Emancipation Act, again, slowly. So the Gradual Emancipation Act would probably be an act that guaranteed that after a certain period of time, all slaves in upstate New York would be free. So under the state's Gradual Emancipation Act, she was due her freedom in 1827. When she realized her slave owner was planning to keep her enslaved, Sojourner ran away with her infant daughter in tow. But this came at a huge cost. She had to leave behind her 5-year-old son. So let's stop for a minute and imagine. I'm going to make a connection to my own life. I have 2 children and they're 9 years apart. So imagine when my daughter was a year or under, and her brother was 9, and I had to make the choice of leaving one behind. That would absolutely tear me apart. But an inference I'm going to make is that Sojourner probably felt that her son would at least be able to survive without her. If she had left an infant, and we say infant, so I'm going to guess anywhere between a few months old to maybe a year. She had left an infant. She probably figured that her daughter would not survive without her. So I think she made the choice to take her daughter because she felt her son might be okay without her. Let's keep reading. The slave owner sold Sojourner's son to a plantation 1,000 miles away in Alabama. Let's stop again, because again, I think he did this to punish her even more, because we've talked about this a little bit before. The further down south you were, usually the worse slavery was. So even though it wasn't a picnic in the north, you usually didn't work on farms doing back-breaking work from sunup to sundown. So he probably did that thinking that, again, if you run away and you think you're coming back to get him, it's not going to happen. I'm going to sell him 1,000 miles away. I wonder if they will ever be reunited. I hope so. Meanwhile, Sojourner remained in hiding in New York until her freedom was official. When the coast was clear, Sojourner filed a court case saying her son had been sold illegally. She was one of the first Black women to file a court case in America. And even though it seemed nearly impossible, she won. She got her son back. Good job. In 1843, she changed her name to Sojourner. Remember, she had been born Isabella. So she decided to change her name to Sojourner, which means traveler. And she became a preacher. She traveled the country sharing her messages for women's rights and the abolition of slavery everywhere. Although Sojourner could neither read nor write, her voice carried far. What do you think that means? Even though she couldn't read or write, her voice carried far. I think it means that even though she couldn't read or write, she spoke so powerfully that it didn't even matter. Her words were powerful and important. Let's keep reading. In December 1851, she gave a speech that she made up on the spot. She was a quick thinker. In it, she advocated on behalf of Black women, advocated, supported, on behalf of Black women who faced the double discrimination of racism and sexism and had often been left out of the fight for equality. So, again, if you were a woman at this time, you did not have the same rights as men. This is in the 1800s, this is almost 200 years ago. So, women weren't allowed to vote, women weren't allowed sometimes to own land. Their husbands had to make decisions for them. So Sojourner advocated being again a woman and not having certain rights and being Black and not having certain rights. The speech is known by its most famous refrain, "Ain't I a woman?" We have to stop again because this is when we talk about our credibility. So again, when Miss Harrison wrote her book, I'm sure she used the most up-to-date sources that she could find. Well, it's been said now that Sojourner probably did not say that. So Sojourner was born in upstate New York. She spoke Dutch. Her first owner was Dutch. And so she spoke Dutch until she was about 9 years old. Then she started learning English when she was sold to a different owner. So she would not have used Southern African dialect at the time. So she wouldn't have known about ain't I and y'all and things like that. We know everybody sort of speaks that way now, or you know people who speak that way. But at the time, Sojourner would not have spoken in a Southern dialect. So it makes me wonder why this is credited to her. And some reasons might be to discredit her intellect because even though she couldn't read or write, the woman was smart. So it might have been to try and give her more of a stereotypical Southern slave characteristics. So let's keep reading. So she went on to encourage African Americans to fight on behalf of the Union in the Civil War, for former slaves to be given places to live, and for desegregation of streetcars. She was an agitator and a fierce activist for equality. So that's the end of our story. But that last line, she was an advocate, an agitator. That reminds me of someone that we lost just a few months ago who talked about getting into good trouble. So you might know who I'm referring to. I'd be referring to John Lewis. John Lewis talked about getting into good trouble. And so, Sojourner, lots of times an agitator might be sort of a negative word that we think about. In this case, Sojourner was getting into good trouble. She wanted to make sure that everything was disruptive. The system that was in place at the time, she wanted to disrupt it. She wanted to get rid of desegregation. She wanted former slaves treated fairly. She wanted women treated fairly. Sojourner was a person who got into good trouble. So now we are going to look at, again, some of our details from our story. We've been talking about significant details and minor details when we do our research and things like that. So some of the things that we read about would be significant details that if I am writing about what we've been learning about with slavery, I might want to include. Some of them would be maybe not as significant details, but still interesting. So let's look over at our chart. So when we look at significant details, what are some of the ones that we talked about? Sojourner ran away. Why is that significant? Because she realized that her owner would not free her. Another significant detail, Sojourner won a court case to get her son back. Why is that so significant? Because she was one of the first Black women in America to win such a case. And then there are minor details that are still interesting with her life, but I might not always put it in the report. So it says she was born Isabella, but she changed her name to something more meaningful to her. So it might be important to include that she was born Isabella, but it's not that significant. Another minor detail, she couldn't read or write. It's minor because, and I said it's minor because she still became a powerful speaker. So now we're going to look at some of your resources that you've been reading and some more from our book, and you are going to talk about some of the things that are significant and some of the things that are not so significant.